Hi folks, and welcome to our video on Stanley Cavell's The World Viewed, Reflections on the Ontology of Film. So who is Stanley Cavell? Well, he's primarily considered to be a philosopher, a professional philosopher, who happens to be interested in film. The school of philosophy he's probably best known for being associated with is called ordinary language philosophy. We'll talk about what that means in a little bit, but the two biggest names that you might want to associate with Cavell and ordinary language philosophy are Ludwig Wittgenstein and J.L. Austin. Cavell is also interested in philosophical skepticism, which is a large philosophical concept we'll talk about more in a little bit, but skepticism can generally be understood as the human condition of not having access to the world, not having certain knowledge of the world. And third, Cavell is known for an interest in the intersections between philosophy and the arts. He's written extensively about literature, opera, painting, film, music. And it's worth mentioning that he's not necessarily interested in the ways that, say, artworks simply illustrate philosophical ideas. He's also deeply interested in what art is as a philosophical question in itself. So I should add maybe a fourth thing that he's interested in, which is aesthetics, the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature of art and beauty. The book that we're going to be discussing is called The World Viewed. It was published in 1971. The first thing you might want to know about The World Viewed, if you're interested in film and film theory, is that it's understood to be a work of classical film theory, which is strange because it was published in 1971. In film studies, we tend to break up film theory into two historical sections: contemporary film theory and classical film theory. And we tend to think of classical film theory as breaking off in the 1960s. As the traditions of psychoanalysis and semiotics and the study of ideology got incorporated into film studies in the late 1960s and 70s, we tend to call that contemporary film theory. But Cavell is not so much part of this trajectory. More specifically, this book, as a work of classical film theory, is associated with realist film theory, the branch of film theory associated with folks like Andre Bazin and Siegfried Kracauer, those who think film is special as a medium of art because of its connection to the material world. Third, one of the major arguments about film is that it has a special relationship with philosophical skepticism. If there's maybe one argument that this book is most famous for, it might be that one, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Fourth is the role that modernism plays in this book. And by modernism, I mean kind of two things. One, modernism as a movement within the arts that's associated with the 19th and 20th century artworks that were understood to be going against traditions and experimenting. And two, modernism as it's related to modernity, the larger socio-cultural changes that happened after the Renaissance with the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment that tend to be going against tradition broadly conceived, usually tradition in the form of religious belief. Lastly, the book is known for its emphasis on classical Hollywood cinema. By classical Hollywood cinema, I mean the movies produced largely between the 1930s and the 1950s that followed strict aesthetic norms and industrial practices. Cavell will make it quite clear that he has an aesthetic preference for classical Hollywood cinema, especially as distinct from the more modernist cinemas that would emerge after classical Hollywood cinema in the 1960s in the United States and in Europe. When we think about Stanley Cavell as a film thinker, we tend to think about his obsession, his interest in classical Hollywood films. The two other books about film that Cavell is known for are these: 1981's Pursuits of Happiness and 1996's Contesting Tears. Each book coins a genre within classical Hollywood cinema, one that he's calling Hollywood comedies of remarriage, which is about screwball comedies from the 1930s and early 40s, and the other he's calling the melodrama of the unknown woman, featuring films primarily from the 1940s. These two subsequent books are going into a lot more detail about individual films. You can call these books primarily works of film criticism that are inflected with a sincere and deep interest in the history of philosophy. By contrast, I would say that The World Viewed, while containing many bits of criticism, is also a work of film theory, and that it contains a lot more abstract arguments about film as a medium. So these are the table of contents of The World Viewed. It's a long and complex book, and each chapter deserves close attention. But it's important to know that a few chapters have been privileged within the history of film studies, and the ideas they contain have been canonized more than others. There's a film theory anthology that reproduces only 4 chapters from this book, and those chapters are 2 through 5, seen here. And so in order to provide what I think is maybe a standard and introductory account to this book, I'm largely going to stick to the kinds of arguments that appear in this part of the book. So the main arguments that occur in those 4 chapters largely concern what's known as Cavell's realism. That is, his arguments about how film is connected to the material world. My main aim right now is to think about how Cavell's realism is distinct from the main thinkers of realism within film theory that come before him. And that main thinker is really Andre Bazin. You can see the connection between Cavell and Andre Bazin even in the secondary title of Cavell's book, Reflections on the Ontology of Film. No thinker in the history of film studies is more associated with that word ontology than Bazin, who wrote a famous essay called The Ontology of the Photographic Image. In both instances, we can think about that word ontology as meaning something like the essence or the being of film. And beyond this connection in the title of the book, Cavell will overtly acknowledge his indebtedness to Bazin. He says, the final or immediate stimulus to consecutive writing of this book came in early 1968 when I read some essays by Andre Bazin. Andre Bazin's famous text, The Ontology of the Photographic Image, perhaps the one he's most famous for, is a complex text, but one of its major arguments, in simplified form, comes from a sentence like this. He says, the existence of the photographed object shares in the existence of the model like a fingerprint. Think about it like this. Bazin really wants his reader to understand the essential difference between photographs and paintings. Like, what is the difference between a photograph of this apple and a painting of this apple? One of Bazin's arguments is going to say that a photograph, even if it's not super sharp and out of focus, still contains something of that apple's being or essence, as if the essence or being of the apple has been transferred or lifted from that apple and projected into the image that we call a photograph. Whereas no matter how much the painting of the apple looks like the apple, it doesn't contain that essence because it's still a rendering of the apple through the artist's hands. So Cavell will say things in his second and third chapters that sound a lot like this kind of argument about photographs, about the relationship between an object in the world and a photograph of that object. So Cavell will say, a photograph does not present us with likenesses of things. It presents us, we want to say, with the things themselves. Now this sentence seems a lot like this other sentence from Bazin's essay, where he says, the photograph has been created out of the ontology of the model. It is the model. Both Bazin and Cavell are saying something like, if you have an apple and a photograph of the apple, it's almost like they are one and the same thing. We know that that's not literally true, but for some reason, saying that it is communicates something unique about that kind of picture. To give you a better sense of how Cavell's reasoning leads him to this conclusion, I want to read you a longer passage. He says, let us notice the specific sense in which photographs are of the world, of reality as a whole. You can always ask, pointing to an object in a photograph, a building, say, what lies behind it, totally obscured by it. This only accidentally makes sense when asked of an object in a painting. You can always ask of an area photographed what lies adjacent to that area, beyond the frame. This generally makes no sense asked of a painting. You can ask these questions of objects in photographs because they have answers in reality. The world of a painting is not continuous with the world of its frame. At its frame, a world finds its limits. We might say a painting is a world, a photograph is of the world. Notice that this passage contains a number of different articulations that all point to the same kind of observation, an observation that was also made by Bazin, that photographs, unlike paintings, seem to have this strong connection, almost a material connection, to the world that they depict. But I want you to look at recurring kinds of phrases and words that point to a major difference between Cavell and Bazin. Look at all of these phrases. You can always ask. When asked of a painting, we might say. And also look at this phrase, we want to say. Cavell tends to use these words a lot, words like ask, say, and we. And I've counted how many times he uses them throughout the entirety of the book, The World Viewed. What does this mean? Is this just an idiosyncrasy of Cavell's writing, or does it mean anything about the methodology that he's applying? Well, it helps point to what's known as ordinary language philosophy, the branch of philosophy that Cavell is most famously associated with. Ordinary language philosophy can be understood as a philosophical method that involves avoiding philosophical theories in favor of close attention to the details of the use of everyday ordinary language. So let me give you an example of what that might mean in practice. Say, for example, you have two philosophers. The philosopher on the right side of the screen is an ordinary language philosopher. The philosopher on the left side of the screen is not an ordinary language philosopher, but might be, say, a philosopher associated with what's called the analytic tradition. Both philosophers are interested in these concepts: knowledge, truth, consciousness, the kinds of concepts that philosophers have been interested in for centuries. The philosopher on the left might try to understand knowledge, truth, or consciousness by asking the question, what is the essence of X? What is the essence of knowledge, truth, and consciousness? And proceed by reflecting abstractly on what those things are. The ordinary language philosopher, though, thinks that this method is a mistake. Instead of asking what is the essence of X, the ordinary language philosopher asks a different question. They might say, what is the precise meaning of X, the word X, in a given sentence uttered in a particular context? The ordinary language philosopher says, wait a minute. The word knowledge has a number of different uses in ordinary language. And by ordinary language, they simply mean the way that native speakers of a given language are going to communicate in everyday contexts. So imagine conversations in which sentences like these will come up. I know how to ride a bike. I know Robert well. I know that you're lying to me. All those sentences use the word know, and thus we might say are part of this general concept that we call knowledge. But each of them has a very different definition of knowledge. And you know that if you speak English, simply because you speak English, and you recognize the differences in those sentences. When I say I know how to ride a bike, you can't know how to do something like ride a bike by reading about riding a bike. You have to do it over and over again until the knowledge becomes absorbed in your body. That's kind of what know-how is. Knowing how to ride a bike is a very different kind of knowledge than knowing that the first film was exhibited in 1895 in France. They both partake in what we call knowledge, but they're different concepts because we know that we invoke the concept knowledge very differently when we utter the word knowledge or know. So the ordinary language philosopher kind of summarizes this approach this way. He says, ordinary language philosophy involves examining what we should say when, and so why, and what we should mean by it. In other words, to get at the essence of some concept philosophically, you have to examine the precise conditions in which you would use the word associated with that context. The implication is sort of that if you speak the language, you already know the differences. You're just not in the habit of articulating those differences to yourself because they're so close to you, because you just know how to use language. So Daniel Morgan summarizes the importance of ordinary language philosophy to the world viewed in this passage. Like, why does it matter that Cavell is using this approach? And why should we emphasize it? He says that when Cavell says that we want to say that photographs present us with, quote, the things themselves, he offers not an end so much as a beginning. It's true that the position cannot be upheld, but it matters that we are tempted by it. As for instance, when in looking at a photograph of the Eiffel Tower, I say that I see the Eiffel Tower, not a representation of it. Part of his goal, Cavell says, is to get us, his readers, to recognize how mysterious photographs are by seeing how difficult it is to talk about them. Their familiarity shouldn't mask their essential strangeness. So when Cavell says that we want to say that photographs present us with the things themselves, Cavell is not making the mistake of equating photographs with the thing that a photograph is of. He's describing a condition of language that he thinks seems like something that you might agree with. He can't guarantee that you would also want to say that, but he is saying it such that it feels right. And those are the grounds for his evidence. So again, I just want to emphasize that although a lot of Cavell's arguments sound very Bazanian, they sound like they are repeating Bazan, the way that he gets at those truths comes from a very different way of thinking. And to expand on one of the major differences, not just in method, but in results, between Cavell's realism and Bazan's realism, we need to talk about philosophical skepticism. So I mentioned earlier that Cavell is associated with philosophical skepticism, and he even will say things that make it very clear that this book is about the relationship between film and skepticism. He says film is a moving image of skepticism. Now, what could that possibly mean? Well, first we need to get a firm grasp of what we mean by philosophical skepticism. It's a family of philosophical views that question the possibility of knowledge, especially common sense knowledge. For example, like knowing that the desk in front of me exists independently of my perception of it. That idea that I can never tell if I'm awake or dreaming, that I can't tell if the desk in front of me is real or an illusion, that I have no certainty about my sensory access to the world, that's a particular kind of skepticism that we call Cartesian skepticism, named for the philosopher René Descartes. And that's primarily the kind of skepticism that Cavell is invoking when he says skepticism. You can think of the premise of the film The Matrix as illustrating, in popular form, a myth about skepticism. The character thinks he's in the real world, but realizes, in fact, that he's just in a simulation and wakes up to find himself in the actual real world. The film teaches us that when you have a computer system that can simulate, through software, a perceptual experience, there is no way to tell the difference between a false perceptual experience and an actual one. This idea is also illustrated in what's known as the brain in a vat thought experiment. How do I know that I'm not just a brain in a vat, getting fed software information, making me think that I'm standing in front of my computer speaking to you? Well, I don't actually know. This is the kind of idea that Cavell is working with. So, what the heck could be the relation between the photographic arts, including film, and philosophical skepticism? Cavell will say, so far as photography satisfied a wish, it was the human wish to escape subjectivity and metaphysical isolation. A wish for a power to reach this world. Here Cavell is presuming that you understand that one of the perpetual obsessions of philosophers throughout the centuries has been this problem of skepticism. How do I actually know? How can I guarantee that I have knowledge of the world that seems to be in front of my senses? So it's important to keep in mind that when Cavell is talking about skepticism as this perpetual obsession within the history of philosophy, he also means to evoke all the ways that skepticism is indeed part of our ordinary lives. We may not, like Neo, the character in The Matrix, question whether our reality is real. Most of us won't. However, think about the fact that I can't guarantee that my spouse is not cheating on me. That I can't guarantee that the words that come out of my best friend's mouth are sincere. That I can never access the mental contents of the people who I hold most close to me. That is also a condition of skepticism, often called other minds skepticism. But it's a similar idea. I do not have guaranteed access to either the world in front of me, because I'm always seeing it filtered through my sensory apparatus, nor do I have complete, unmediated perceptual access to the mental contents of the people around me. That creates, Cavell thinks, this kind of underlying anxiety and a wish that we can fix that problem or even feel like we're fixing it. So he says that film and photography, in a way, can make it feel like we're fixing that problem. They satisfy the wish to escape our own subjectivity and our own isolation. How do they do that, though? We can think about it this way. Let's say I'm looking at that apple we talked about earlier. I can only reach that apple, to use Cavell's term, through my senses or subjectivity. When I look at it, I'm not necessarily grasping it, but I am seeing it through my eyes, which are a particular way of beholding images of the world. But when photography was invented, something happened. The camera can reach the apple independently of my senses, not subjectively through me, but objectively, because the camera is a machine, a mechanism, whose functioning is somewhat automatic in capturing images of the world. I can, of course, change the angle of the camera, I can change the image, but there is something about light itself and the apple itself that work to produce the image of the apple. So unlike a painting of the apple, which was purely my subjectivity rendering the image, the photograph of the apple seems to be partly produced by the world itself, by the apple itself. So when I see that photographic image or a film, it almost feels like, for the first time in history, I can reach the material world independently of my senses. Now keep in mind, this does not solve the problem of skepticism. I can only, of course, access the photograph of the apple through my own eyes. However, I am seeing a view of the world that feels much less like it's filtered through my own perceptual apparatus. And think about films for a second. When we sit in a movie theater together and we're all looking at the same series of images, of photographic images of the world, we're seeing very lifelike images of the world, but we're all seeing them from the same angle. Something which we just cannot do with the apple that's in front of us when we're sitting in a circle around it. Cavell is trying to get us to realize that this is a momentous shift in the history of our access to the world. So why is this way of thinking about photography different from, say, Bazin's way of thinking about photography? Well, to understand that, we need to look at a phrase I elided in the first version of this passage. What he really says is that so far as photography satisfies a wish, it satisfied a wish not confined to painters, but the human wish to escape subjectivity and metaphysical isolation. Let me contextualize that further. Above this passage, he says, it is, for example, misleading to say, as Bazin does, that photography has freed the plastic arts from their obsession with likeness. For this makes it seem, and it does often look, as if photography and painting were in competition, or that painting had wanted something that photography broke in and satisfied. So what Cavell is saying here is that the thing that photography changed in the history of the world was not our attempt to produce likenesses through images. It was much bigger. It was not just about, say, the history of painting. It was the history of people trying to access the world with knowledge. You can put it this way. Bazin says that photography satisfied the artist's perpetual desire for realism in images, for an image that would look or be a lot like the thing that they were trying to reproduce. But Cavell says, no, much bigger than that. Photography satisfied every human being's desire to access the world beyond the limits of our own subjectivity. This is not just about artists and images and getting things real. It was about human beings and the world, and feeling as if we have some kind of access to the world beyond the limits of our own subjectivity. So that's how skepticism relates to Cavell's realism, and further how that distinguishes Cavell's realism from, say, Bazin's. The third thing I want to talk about is the role of criticism in this book. What do I mean by criticism? Well, I mean art criticism, the discussion, analysis of individual works of art. I don't mean criticism in the idea of like critiquing something or saying that it's bad, like when I criticize you for your behavior. No, I mean criticism in the sense that's used within the humanities, which is a word that we use to mean the discussion or analysis of individual works of art. Throughout this book, Cavell will talk about why criticism is important to the arguments that he's making in his book. In a way, criticism is indeed important to most works of film theory. Most works of film theory contain some kind of analysis of individual works of art, in this case, films. But it might be fair to say that Cavell is one of the film thinkers who cares the most about the nature of criticism and talks the most about why criticism matters to the arguments that he's making. That's not something that most film theorists actually examine. So throughout the book, especially in the preface and the foreword and the first chapter, Cavell will kind of talk about his values as a film thinker. He'll really emphasize what he keeps calling experience, the experience of the film, his experience of the artwork. And he'll kind of make it clear that what he means by experience is opposed to what you might call technical or scientific certainty, the kind of stuff that was really popular in the 1970s with semiotics and shot-by-shot breakdowns. Anytime that you use theory to aspire to something that resembles scientific objectivity in your approach to analyzing art, he's like, I don't want to do that at all. He thinks that's a problem. So in the foreword to his book, he'll actually talk about a class about film aesthetics that he taught. And he comes to some kind of discovery in teaching that class. And he says this. He says, the only technical matters we found ourselves invoking in this class, so far as they were relevant to the experience of particular films, which was our only business, are in front of your eyes. So in this passage, he's talking about our inclination in, say, film studies to count shots, or to label shots as POV shots, or to come up with names like shot reverse shot, or to talk about camera angles. All those kinds of technical specificities. He thinks that they don't actually get us very far, and that in aspiring for technical specificity, we might be erasing our own experience of the film as a world unfolding in front of our eyes for about 2 hours. In a similar way, he'll talk about the importance of memory. What's really strange about this book is that he was writing it at a time before he could, say, access these films easily and watch them again before he wrote them. And he'll acknowledge this. He'll say, most of the films that I'm writing about in this book, I'm writing about from memory. Some of them I've only seen once. In most film studies today, we would never do this, and furthermore, we would never admit it. But for Cavell, there's something about memory that highlights the importance of experience. That even though we might think about memory as a problem when it comes to analysis, he thinks that's not really a problem because you can never be not subjective when you're talking about your experience of art. It just is subjective. So he says, a few faulty memories will not themselves shake my conviction in what I've said, since I am as interested in how a memory went wrong as in why the memories that are right occur when they do. So once again, he's not trying to overcome the fact that what he's doing is subjective. That's because he has a large philosophical stake in the fact that encounters with art are only ever subjective. That doesn't mean that they can't be intersubjective, that we exchange our subjectivities in order to find some kind of common ground, but it doesn't mean that we come up with some scientific language or set of principles that impose scientific certainty on the act of doing art criticism. He also mentions this important word, conviction. He'll emphasize throughout this book that all the things that he's saying about film and individual films arise from his subjective conviction rather than some kind of idea of objective reporting. And again, because a lot of us are trained to think about art criticism as needing to be as objective as possible, maybe as neutral as possible, we might be offended by this. But the reason that he's so insistent upon maintaining the conviction of his insights is that he knows that art is the kind of thing that cannot be reduced to a rational or logical set of principles. Art is not a math problem, and that's essential to understanding the uniqueness of art as a thing in the world. So why does this emphasis on criticism and on subjective conviction matter for him? And why might it matter within the history of film theory? Well, he'll talk about this in the book. He'll say it is arguable that the only instruments that could provide data for a theory of film are the procedures of criticism. So one way of answering the question, why does criticism matter for Cavell, is to say it is necessary for doing theory. To theorize is usually to make some general hypothesis or claim about the nature of a thing, or in film studies, an artistic medium. And he says you can't do theory without criticism. What does he mean? He expands on that in a passage here. He says, giving significance to and placing significance in specific possibilities and necessities of the physical medium of film are the fundamental acts of, respectively, the director of a film and the critic or audience of film. What constitutes an element of the medium of film is not knowable prior to these discoveries of direction and criticism. He's basically saying that you can't know what film as a medium is until you watch movies. And each movie will teach you something different about film as a medium because each movie is a different instance of that medium of film. You don't learn the same thing about what film can do when you watch different movies. Think of this way of thinking as a response to a tendency within film theory and art theory in general to theorize the nature of a medium just by reflecting upon the nature of that medium, by describing objectively its properties. We might think about all the different components that make up film as a medium. We might think about the nature of the celluloid that runs through the projector. We might think about the nature of a film camera. We might think about the fact that the screen is flat and rectangular, and that we must watch it together in a dark room. All of these things are indeed properties of what we call cinema. But Cavell thinks that we really can't come to any knowledge about cinema just by reflecting upon those properties. We might call that, say, media essentialism, where we ask what is the essence of a medium, come up with these properties, and just think about what those properties entail. Instead, Cavell is going to say that we need media criticism first. We need to ask, what does this particular instance of the medium, this film, teach me about the possibilities of that medium? Each film will theoretically teach me something different, and only from those encounters with individual films can I come to any kind of general truth about the thing that I'm calling film. But in response to this, you might say, Cavell, what about all those ontological reflections that you've talked about in your opening chapters about photography? Aren't you just doing that kind of media essentialism, that philosophical navel-gazing, just by thinking about what a photograph is? Well, Cavell will anticipate this objection, and here's what he'll say. He'll say the common appeal to technological properties is caused in part by a sense that the sheer power of film is unlike the power of the other arts. Here he's acknowledging that the history of film theory has involved a lot of attention to the technological properties of film, what we've called media essentialism. And here he's admitting that there's a good reason for this. He's not chastising anyone for doing this. He's even saying, I share this sense. He says, I agree that this power is essentially related to film's technology. But, he says, the aesthetic role of this technology is not specified by studying it apart from its specific achievements in significant films. So Cavell will come to say that he's only discovered the general truths that he claims about the technological specificity of photography and film from his encounters with individual films. Interestingly, the films that he loves best, classical Hollywood films. And this is another thing that we might talk about in another video on Cavell, that even though Cavell is a realist, that he's really interested in the connection between material reality and film as a medium, his favorite movies are not the ones that we call realist. They are not, say, confined to the long take, deep focus techniques of Orson Welles or the dead time of Italian neorealism. And in order to answer that question, why that's the case, we'd have to talk about the hidden variable that I haven't talked about in this video, but I just want to say would help bring everything together, which is film's relationship to modernism. If you want to understand this entire book as containing a flowing argument that links criticism and ordinary language philosophy and skepticism and classical Hollywood cinema, I would say the thing that brings it all together is modernism, which I'll talk about in the next video. Thanks.